welcome everybody tonight. Good to see everybody. And for those of you who join us online, we appreciate you tuning in tonight as well. I hope you all had a good week. Hopefully you're enjoying this nice weather that we've been having lately. It's really been nice and beautiful outside. And I understand there may be some weather coming our way, but I'm just thankful that we don't live up north where they're just getting all that snow. I mean, that is just crazy. There's, I guess one of those states, I don't know, it was Minnesota or something, they're expecting like more snow than they probably have ever gotten in the history of the state or something like that. It's ridiculous.
Angel and them got 37 inches less.
That is just, yeah, fathomable. And then Ben and them are going to get a lot too. Theirs was like last week, I think. They got a lot, so I don't want anything to do with all that. No. I'm glad that we don't get snow. We get a little bit of snow, it's just fun, right? You don't have to deal with all that. Well, we're going to go ahead and get into our Bible study tonight of Acts, and we're moving into Acts chapter 25. You know, fear is one of those emotions that can be counterintuitive to our faith. Sometimes fear is a good thing whenever, like, we tell our kids not to do something and we make them afraid, and they fear us or fear the consequences, and so they don't do it. And sometimes that can be a good thing when you think of fear. But when we think of it, how it influences our faith, sometimes fear can keep us from experiencing some of God's greatest blessings. What are some examples of that statement? Something we could be afraid of that would keep us from some of God's greatest blessings.
Maybe witnessing.
Witnessing, right? If you're afraid to witness or talk to somebody about Jesus, and you know, who knows? God could use you to talk to that person. Next thing you know, that person's life could be completely changed. And you would be a blessing to be a part of that. But yeah. Any other example?
Teaching.
Huh?
Teaching.
Teaching
A class or
yeah.
a special group.
An opportunity to teach and speak into someone else's life. Sometimes it can prevent us from doing the right thing. And we got an example of that. Being afraid it'll keep you from doing the right thing.
Afraid of what other people might think.
Okay, being afraid of what others might think, so you choose not to do it.
Or fear, like, can paralyze you, so it can keep you from going into a new church for the first time where God wants you, or it can keep you from saying yes to get to marry the person God has for you, or...
Yeah, those are can be big decisions and keep you from making those decisions because you're afraid of the unknown or what might, come as a result of it. Sometimes it can actually harm us more. It can actually make us harm ourselves more when we're afraid. Imagine a small kid who makes his way to the top of the monkey bars, only to get stuck out of fear once he gets up so high. You know, kids that do that. They get up, they climb up high, and they get up there and like, oh, now I'm scared. Their fear is not only preventing them from taking necessary next steps, which is climbing down and getting back onto the ground where it's safe. It's actually keeping them in a more dangerous place than if they took the steps to get down. Their fear, which is supposed to be self-preservative, can cause them to harm themselves. And if you think about it, our fears can cause us to focus on self-preservation in a way that harms other people and ultimately harms us too. Well, in this passage tonight that we're going to be looking at, Paul demonstrates his faith over his fears. Now, I don't think for 1 minute that Paul didn't experience fear. I mean, I know Paul experienced fear. Sometimes we think Paul is we build him up in our minds that we think Paul is some kind of super Christian. Which the truth is, he's just a human fallen man, just like all the rest of us. And we know he had fears because, remember, he had those, we talked about it before, where he was, really debating on where he should go and following the Lord and different things. So we know that Paul had his own reservations. He had his own fears that he was dealing with, his own struggles. But he resolved to not allow his fears to prevent him from following Jesus or following the way, doing what the Lord wanted him to do. Even to the point that he said, I will follow Jesus to the day I die. If that means dying, then I'm gonna go. I'm not gonna let anything keep me from doing what the Lord wants me to do. Now, if we're going to be stubborn about something, that's a good thing. That's a good thing to be stubborn about, is following the Lord Jesus. So I want us to recap before we get into chapter 25 and kind of remember what's happening. Paul had been in custody now for 2 years because, remember, Felix was too self-absorbed to release them. Either he didn't want to make the Jews mad and wanted to stay in good favor with the Jews, or maybe in addition to that, he wanted to see if Paul would bribe him and give him some money so he could again enrich himself. In any case, Paul didn't do that, and so now his appointment as procurator has ended, and his predecessor is now coming in to follow him, Porcius Festus. Now, he's assigned as governor. Now, let's read about that encounter that Paul has with Festus. So we begin in chapter 25. And we'll read verses 1 through 6 to begin. It says, Now when Festus had come to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore, he said, Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man, to see if there is any fault in him. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. All right, so here's this encounter that Festus has with the Jews here. These same Jews that have been after Paul for quite some time. Now, Festus is making his way to Jerusalem, which is the capital city of Judea right there at the time. So it's kind of like the whole region he's governing. His home, where he will live, kind of his home base, is going to be there at Caesarea, on that coastal town. But he's going to make his way around the different provinces and kind of, letting his face be known. This is kind of what these Roman rulers would do as they would make their way around, and people could get to know them and see them. And it kind of it's a way for him to just kind of flex his muscles and let people know, hey, we're still in charge, and Rome's way of letting people know who's running the world. So he is now the new procurator or governor, and he would have barely had time to even talk to Paul. Okay, and by the indications here, he is planning on talking to Paul. He probably knew about Paul being there, but he hasn't had a chance to even speak to Paul at this point. And he would be a lot less knowledgeable about the Jewish laws than, say, Felix was. Because remember, Felix was married to a Jewish wife, a Jewish woman. And so he would have been less knowledgeable about their laws and customs and things like that. So for him, he really wanted to have really wanted to hear Paul out to find out why this man was being held in custody, and here's the accusation brought against him. Now, as soon as this transition happened, these same Jews immediately tried to manipulate the situation. Because what did they do? What was the first thing they did? They said, hey, we want you to bring him up here to us and let us, try the case before us. Let us be able to bring these accusations against him. And then you could try him before us. Well, in doing so, what was their goal? What was their end game?
You know, jump along the way.
Yeah. And why did they need him to be brought to Jerusalem to do that?
Because it's being protected.
In custody, in Roman custody, there would be no way they could get to him. The easiest way for them to get to Paul would be on this journey. And by the way, all of the Romans, those who were in the know knew it. Remember the centurion, the commander? Remember when he was getting ready to take Paul away? He'd already witnessed Paul almost being mobbed twice, right? And so when he took Paul to Caesarea in the first place, down to where Felix was, when he took him down there in the first place, remember he took him with 200 guards and all these footmen and these soldiers. And they knew that, and he took him at 9 o'clock at night, because they knew that that's when they'd be most vulnerable. That's whenever they'd be most vulnerable for an attack, is whenever they would be on the roads. As they're walking through the mountains and, the rocky hillsides and things like that. That's often when you see people ambushed and attacked. And so that's what they began to do. They didn't have any intention for Paul to be actually tried. And by the way, they knew that they really don't have a case against him. He'd already been tried. By the way, they'd already tried to do this a couple of times. Remember, they had tried to do it once before, and then they had the 40-plus guys that had had the oath to ambush him and kill him if they would bring him out one more time. That's when they had him taken down to Caesarea. Now, it would be impossible to kill Paul while he was in Roman custody, so they had to get him moved. But Festus agreed to hear them out. The solution Festus saw was, listen, if you got a problem against Paul, I want to hear the case. Just come follow me. I'm going to be going back down to Caesarea. You can follow me down there, and then I will hear you out. And so, what does all of this show us about the sovereignty of God?
Yeah, he's in control.
Yeah. God was in control. Remember, God had already told Paul, okay, you've already testified to me before all these Jews in Asia, and you will testify before me in Rome. Right? God had already told Paul that in the night vision. So, God communicated that to Paul. Paul knows God's will. Paul knows that God's in control. But God is working all this. Paul doesn't know any of this is happening. Luke gives us insight into all of this in the looking back on it as he's, reporting it or recording it, as he's put all this together, the story of the Acts of the Apostles. He's writing it down retrospectively. But Paul doesn't know any of this is going on. All Paul knows is he's back there in Caesarea, locked up in custody, waiting his trial, waiting his release. And so, but Festus is having this whole conversation with the Jews, and it just goes to show you that Festus is not in control, Rome's not in control, the Jews aren't in control, it's God who's in control. And that's something to note as far as our lives too, because God is the same God that's in control of Paul's life is in control of all of ours. And so we need to remember that, especially when it comes to things that could cause us and cause us to be fearful. I want you to notice verses 7 through 12 as we look at this next little portion and see Festus' encounter with Paul. It says, when he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. And while he answered for himself, neither against the law or of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, You have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. So, almost 2 weeks later, after the time that Festus is now in command as the procurator of Judea, and it's now his whole show. You know, it's been turned over to him. He finally hears Paul's case. Notice how Luke, as he writes, again looking back, he keeps writing that these charges that they have against Paul could not be proven. Why are these charges illegitimate, or why do they have no proof for these charges? Do you remember? We've talked about this in class, but just so you remember. Why is it that Luke keeps indicating this, and we keep seeing this kind of theme over and over again, that the charges cannot be proved?
Because they didn't see it happen.
Right. The witnesses are the Jews from Asia. A very long ways away, okay? Very far away, probably 2 weeks boat, ride or journey. And so they're not the same Jews that saw or say they saw, Paul with, bringing these Gentiles. By the way, what they saw was not the truth anyway. It was all misunderstanding. Because they were saying that Paul had dishonored the temple by bringing in a Gentile into the temple, which was not the case. Paul was talking to a Gentile and had a Gentile relationship with a Gentile, but he did not bring that Gentile into the areas where they weren't supposed to go. A Gentile could enter into some areas. Remember we talked about this. Some areas of the temple you could go into, but there were other areas where it was only Jews, and so Paul would know that, and he wouldn't have done that. So the fact is, they kept saying it was for his preaching, but for the actual charge that he could be tried for, there was no witnesses. So it could not really be proven. And so there was kind of like just a trial that was, what was it called, a straw man trial. It was something that had no power on no legs. So he couldn't go anywhere, nothing could happen. But Festus, he wants to hear, he kind of wants to get favor with these Jews. He doesn't want to create enemies. Again, Roman leaders did not necessarily want to have the whole society against them. They wanted to be held in favor with the people. And so he wanted to do the Jews a favor, says to Paul, well, if you have nothing to be afraid of, if you don't think you did anything wrong, won't you just go to Jerusalem with me? And we'll hear you out there. Now, what's in Jerusalem that's not right here?
The Jews?
Yeah, specifically is the Sanhedrin. Now, Sanhedrin are the highest ranking, body of the Jewish religion. Okay, they're the ones that oversee everything. They make all decisions. They're the ones that, determine whether something is right or wrong. They determine, based on the law, if something is sinful or not sinful. 613 laws in the Old Testament that the Sanhedrin would have been, abide by. They would govern themselves by those laws. But then there was all these oral traditions and things that had been kind of added to God's law over time, and those had all come out of these various religious councils and such. One of those councils was basically that same council of Jerusalem where the Christian Jews had gotten together, and remember they made that statement saying that, salvation was by faith alone. Where you didn't need to be circumcised to have salvation, opening the doors to Gentiles and such under the hand of Peter and John and James and the Apostle Paul as well. So there was all these various laws and so this Sanhedrin would have been the highest ranking body. Now, Paul knew about them because, he was a member. He used to be a member of the Sanhedrin. So he would have known all about them, and he would have known that that's not where he wants to go. That's kind of going the opposite direction that God wanted him to go. Remember, God said, you want to go to Rome? And so it kind of opened the door, and Paul began seeing, hey, the Lord's wanting me to go this way. I'm not going back. I'm going this way. And so he felt as though it wasn't, that he wasn't going to do that. And so he used his citizenship to appeal to Caesar. Okay? And Paul says, hey, I'm willing to pay for any crime that I've done. If I'm guilty of anything, he said, I'll pay the consequence. Even if it's something that I'm deserving of death. If I'm tried and I've committed some crime and I'm found guilty, then I'll go and I'll even die for my crimes. But he said, at this point, I don't think I've done anything wrong, and so I'm appealing to Caesar. And so he appealed to the emperor at the time, was Nero, and so that's where he was going to go. Now, remember we talked about God already telling Paul he was going to go appear before Caesar. He would go to Rome and preach the gospel also. So he knew this was just God opening the door for him to take the next step. And after counseling with his advisors, Festus agrees to have Paul sent to Rome. And it was one of the only places Paul had not been was to Rome itself. And so Paul was excited about going there where he could also, tell his story and preach the gospel there as well. And it would be all along the way Paul would do that and would tell that, be able to preach the gospel going from this day forward. All right? So, next week we'll get into seeing Paul's journey as he's getting ready to go and what's happening, what's taking place, and what happens in the aftermath of his appeal to Caesar. But as we wrap up tonight, I have just two thoughts to leave to you. Because as we consider Paul having faith or dealing with fear in your life, I want to encourage you to demonstrate faith or have faith in God. In other words, don't let fear dictate your decisions that you make. Again, Paul, I don't believe for 1 minute was somebody who was a superhuman Christian. I believe he was just a simple person just like you and I. But he had complete trust in God, and he had resolved himself to not allow his fear to influence his decisions. His decisions would be based upon his faith in God. And we've seen that all along this study. Someone once said, faith is the opposite of fear. But I kind of disagree with that. Because the Bible tells us perfect love casts out fear. And so I would say love is the opposite of fear. Because if you think about it as far as God is concerned, the more you understand God's love and how much He loves you and cares for you, the less you will be overwhelmed by fear as you begin to put your faith and trust in Him. Paul was deeply in love with God. He had a deep love and devotion to the Lord Jesus. And because of that, he was able to overcome his fears and put his confidence in the Lord. So, first of all, demonstrate faith, but don't be foolish. There's a difference between faith and foolishness, isn't there? There's a fine line. Took a lot of faith for Peter to step out of the boat and walk on water. I believe he's probably the only other human that did it besides the Lord Jesus himself, walk on water. So it takes a lot of faith to do that. But later on, we're going to see in the story, it's going to take a lot more faith to stay on the boat than it will to get off. And that's what we're going to see in the life of Paul. Now, God doesn't want us to go out and play in the traffic on I-26 just to prove the fact that we can, God will protect us and take care of us. That would be silly. But we must believe that God has our lives in His hand and trust that His plan is best, whatever that plan may be, as we would trust Him, trust His way and will for our lives. Having faith not fear. All right, we're going to go ahead and close out tonight, and we're going to go to prayer time and take any prayer requests that you might have. If you are joining us tonight online and have a prayer request you'd like to share with us, we would love to be able to pray with you and unite with you in prayer. Simply leave that prayer request in the comments section below the video, or you can go to our website, riveroakcc.org, and click on the prayer tab and leave your prayer request there, and we will be praying for you. And in any case, we hope that we'll see you very soon, and God bless you until we see you